Commissioner Einhauser,
Yes, can you
yeah,
hear me?
yes, sir. You can begin the meeting if you like. Commissioner Forte will not be joining us today, so I'm not sure if you'll be acting chair or if
All right.
Commissioner Coleman will be.
Is Commissioner Coleman here?
Yes, I'm here.
Lane, you want to chair the meeting?
Sure.
Then take it away.
Time now is 3:01. I'd like to call the Special Finance Committee to order. Roll call, please.
Commissioner Coleman,
Present, Detroit, Michigan.
Commissioner Einhauser,
Present, and I'm in Detroit, Michigan.
all right, and Commissioner Forte will not be joining us today, but we do have a quorum.
Excellent, excellent. At this time, I'd like to call for a motion to approve the agenda as presented.
I would so move.
I'll second it. All in favor, signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? Hearing none, the motion passes. Line item 4, approval of minutes from April 17th, 2023. Is that right? Okay.
I move adoption of the minutes.
I second it. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Any oppositions? Hearing none. This motion also passes. Line item number 5, public participation. Do we have any?
Mr. Chair, I'll read the instructions for public participation. To make a comment, please raise your hand using the raise hand icon on your desktop or mobile device using the Zoom app. If you are calling into the meeting by phone, press *9 to raise your hand. During public comment, after your name is called, you will be given permission to unmute. In order to begin speaking, you will have to unmute yourself. To do so, press the unmute button, which is the microphone icon if you're online or on the Zoom app, or *6 if you're calling in. You will have a limit of 3 minutes to make your comment. There will be a timer indicating your remaining time. If you're online and make a comment, we kindly request you fill out the comment card link that's located in the chat. By filling out this card, we will have your contact information to follow up appropriately. You will only be called upon once. Once the chair closes public comment, there will be no other comments from the public during this committee meeting. Mr. Chair, I'm just looking at the attendees list, and I do not see any hands raised at this time, Mr. Chair. I see Commissioner Coleman stepped away for a moment.
Okay.
Sorry about that.
Mr. Chair, I don't see any hands raised at this time.
Okay. All right. Can we put the agenda back up, please? Thank you. This time we go to communications. There is none. Unfinished business. There is none. New business. Line item A, 2025 tax 66. Final proposed FYI 2026 operating budget.
Yeah. Good afternoon. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Good afternoon, commissioners. Good afternoon, Mr. Chair. This is a
Good
Special
afternoon.
Finance Committee meeting today to present the operating budget and the rates and schedule of fees for FY 2026. We'll start with the next slide. We will start with the budget considerations for FY 2026. The DWSD executive team and all our staff and members, we considered these factors in developing the budget for FY 26. Affordability, of course, is at the very top of our priorities here. We want to keep rates low, and our major consideration was to keep rates below 4% and support water conservation initiatives. We are also very compassionate in response to customer service. Public health is very critical. Operations that support and preserve public health meet or exceeds all governmental regulations, whether it be federal, state, or local. Another key consideration for us was the safety of our employee and our infrastructure and our assets. We keep an eye on our upgrades for both the water and sewer, including lead service line replacement. And finally, focusing on our employees. We want to make sure we train, retain, and recruit the best qualified employees for our organization. The next slide is just a brief summary of our current environment in which the budget was developed, and as well as some highlights that I want to go through quickly here before we get into the numbers. The proposed FY 2026 operating budget was, as I mentioned before, was developed with the goal to keep rates very affordable for our citizens. And at the same time, we did not want to compromise on our service level initiatives. The budget incorporates expenditures that are required to operate our system as a whole, keeping these two goals in mind. These expenditures, which we technically call revenue requirement, that is required to operate the system effectively and efficiently. As you'll see in the numbers in the slides that follow, our total system-wide revenue requirement increased by 5.2%, about roughly $26 million. Departmental expenses, or we call them direct expenses, increased by 5.6%, or approximately $6 million. And non-departmental expenses, which we call indirect expenses, increased by 5.2%, roughly $20 million over FY 2025. Revenue finance capital, which is a very minuscule part of our revenue structure, is projected at $2.6 million, a reduction of $0.3 million over FY 25. The verbiage here says increase, but it's truly not increase. It's projected at $2.6 million, which, as I said, led to reduction of $300,000 over FY 25. The increase in revenue requirement for 2026 is primarily due to increase in wholesale charges from GLWA, amounting to about $12.3 million. We had our bad debt estimate at $6.1 million. Our personnel expenses increased by $2.1 million. And our non-personnel expenses, which is made up of various other expenses other than salaries and wages and benefits, increased by $3.4 million. And finally, pension expense increased by $1.9 million. The personnel cost that showed increase is due to addition of net 20 new positions. We'll get to that a little bit later. These new additions are for operations only and are critical to improving our service level as well as to catch up on our backlog work. So at the end of the day, the total system revenue requirement of $521.3 million, which includes both water and sewer, is offset by non-rate revenue of $25.9 million, resulting in a rate revenue increase of $495.4 million. On a system-wide basis, this represents a 4.8% rate revenue increase when you compare it to FY 2025. The 4.8% increase in rate revenue is offset by increase in volume and meter counts, averaging in the range of 1.1% to 2% over the FY 25 volume and meter counts. The offset resulted in a rate increase of 3.5% on a system-wide basis. The budget proposes, at the end of the presentation, we'll talk about the rate increase. The budget proposes a 3.5% increase in rates across the system, which would include our water as well as sewer, including drainage, except for private fire line. And then this rate increase is necessary for us to operate the system and meet the budgetary considerations that I spoke about in the very first page. Now, this rate increase is consistent with the annual inflation rate. If you look at the inflation rate over the last year or two, it's been hovering over, it obviously came down from 7 to 9% in the middle of 2022, has been showing a downward trend, but it's been hovering around 3+% over the last over FY 2024. When you look at the data in December, the rate was 2.9%, but it jumped back to 3% in January. So keeping that in mind, keeping inflation hovering around 3%, according to the Consumer Price Index, we are pretty consistent with that increase. This obviously, the inflation rate is obviously higher than the expectation, but that's what it is right now.
May I ask a question?
Yes, please.
The second bullet point from the bottom, where you say the 4.8% required increase in revenue is offset by
Mhm.
it's offset by increased usage?
Yes. So our overall revenue requirement when it comes to rate revenue is 4.8%, but then because of our usage and our volume increased for water as well as sewer, that rate increase is offset by the increase in volume. So
Meaning we're getting more users in the system and they're using more water?
correct,
Okay.
correct.
And do we know what Great Lakes rate increase is yet?
Yes, Great Lakes increased their wholesale rate, the revenue requirement 5.9% for the water system and 4.5% for the sewer system.
Wow. Okay.
Move on.
Yes, please.
Okay. Okay, revenue requirement, excuse me. Revenue requirement, meaning the revenues that we require to cover our projected expenses on a system-wide basis. So this is the top level summary of what makes up our revenue requirement. So as I mentioned before, there are three components that make up our revenue requirements. One is the departmental expenses, which we also call the direct expenses, over which we have some control. Then the second component is non-departmental expenses. We also call it indirect expense, over which DWSD has very little or no control. And I'll go through what makes up the non-departmental expenses and departmental expenses as we go through the presentation. Revenue finance capital is a minuscule part of this overall revenue requirement structure. It's just kind of revenue that potentially could finance our short-term capital needs, not the long-term, but short-term. The middle part of this slide says how revenue requirement is financed. So we have two sources of revenues that supports our expenditures. One is called the retail revenue, and the other one is non-retail revenue. And I'll get into what is retail and non-retail revenue in the slides to follow. If you break down our total revenue requirement by our two systems, water system and sewer system, the water fund revenue requirement is going up $9.2 million at 6.6%. And our sewer fund revenue requirement is going up by 4.7% at $16.7 million. Now, this is just a revenue requirement increase, not necessarily the rate. These increases will be, as I'll explain later, will be offset by usage increase. The next slide is just a graphical presentation of our overall revenue requirement. You see that huge orange piece of the pie is really the non-departmental expenses over which us, DWSD, has very little or no control. And as I go through, I will let you know what those non-departmental expenses are, but they make up 78% of our total pie, total revenue requirement pie. The departmental expenses share of the pie is 22%, and of course, revenue finance capital is almost zero. So let's dive into our first component of our revenue requirement, which is the departmental expenses. These are expenses, as I mentioned before, we can control to a certain degree. It makes up 5.6% increase over FY 2025. And what makes up the departmental expenses are our natural classification of expenses, such as salaries, wages, benefits, and so on. If you look at the chart, majority of the increase is in personnel and non-personnel costs, such as supplies and others. All of these increases are necessary to improve our service levels, as well as to address the backlog in service deliverables. Increase in personnel costs is due to the addition of net 20 new positions, which will strengthen our service level efforts. Supplies and other related costs are necessary to support the increased level of activities. I'm sorry?
No.
Okay. Supplies and other costs are necessary. The increase is necessary to support our increased level of planned activities because now we have 20 new employees that will boost our service levels. The next slide is a graphical presentation of our departmental expenses. As you see, the biggest pie sharing of the pie is the blue, light blue portion, which makes up our salaries and wages, and the orange part is our benefits. So those two combined make up 53% of our not departmental expenses that we can somehow control or monitor closely. Non-departmental expense, the second component of our revenue requirement, is non-departmental. This is where several expenses here are not within our control. For example, the wholesale charges are determined by GLWA. That increased by $12.3 million for fiscal over FY25. Obligation to GLWA and post-bifurcation debt service are, again, all debt service related costs that we cannot control. These are for debt we issued in the past, and then these are the debt service requirements. Bad debt is another big component of this cost structure here. As you know, bad debt has been increasing lately because of our history of our collection rates. This year, it is a $6.1 million increase. Again, completely based on our revenue requirement and adjustments for collection rate. Again, FYI for FY26, bad debt estimation was increased by 1% for water and sewer. So it went up from 10% to 11%, and then drainage rate was left unchanged at 17%. There was an increase in pension expense based on actuarial determined required contribution. In my previous meeting in February, I showed you 0 for this expense line item, but subsequent to that meeting, we got notification from the City of Detroit's retirement system that we will have to contribute to the legacy costs for pension. And that amount is shared between us and GLWA, but that's a new line item of $4.4 million. An increase of $1.9 million over last year. Graphically, you see that light blue again. The huge component of our non-departmental expense is the wholesale charges, makes up 60% of our non-departmental or indirect cost. Looking at post and pre-bifurcation, debt service is 19% of that pie. And bad debt is the third largest category and accounts for 17% of the indirect cost or non-departmental cost. So I mentioned before that there are two sources of revenues that support our expenditures, namely the retail revenue and non-retail revenue. Within retail revenue, what makes up retail revenue is rate revenue and non-rate revenue. So under rate revenue, you have our 4 categories of income source, commodity sale, which is the sale for volume, the usage. Then we have survey charges, drainage revenue by itself stands on its own. And then there's a revenue line called fire line for private fire lines. So those 4 pieces make up the rate revenue structure. And then the non-rate piece is the permit fees or penalties and other fees, miscellaneous fees that make up the non-rate revenue. Together, the rate revenue and the non-rate revenue is what we term it as retail revenue for the system. And then there's a non-retail piece also. And what makes up the non-retail piece is other revenues such as shared services revenue from GLWA, the IWC charges. IWC stands for industrial waste charges, and then the GLWA share of legacy costs. So GLWA does share with us the pension cost, as well as the cost for debt service for the B and C notes, which were issued several years ago uh, around the bankruptcy time to cover pension cost. So at the end, again, is the total revenue made up of retail revenue as well as non-retail revenue. All of these revenue requirement will equal the revenue requirement amounts on slide 4. Components of rate revenue, then what actually makes up the rate revenue, which impacts customers directly, because these are the amounts that will determine what our final rates will be to our citizens. So the first part, the rate revenue requirement, as I said before, commodity surge charges, the service charges, fire line and drainage charges, that makes up the rate revenue. If you look at the fund-wise distribution of that revenue requirement of $495 million, water fund shares $140 million of that, and the sewer fund $355.3 million. So the water fund requirement has gone up by 5.5%, and the sewer requirement has gone up by 4.6%. At the bottom part of this slide is showing how we arrive at the rate revenue requirement in context of the total revenue requirement. So when we take the total revenue requirement of $521 million for the system as a whole, this includes both water and sewer, we back out the non-rate revenue, or non-retail revenue, I should say, which are the shared services, the GLWA charges, the IWC charges, as well as the non-rate revenue such as permit fees, penalties, and miscellaneous kind of revenues. Once we do that, we come down to the rate revenue. So this is the key number that we focus on for determining rates. Next slide would be just again a graphical thing. It shows us the various components of the rate revenue. The blue side is our commodity charges. This is actual usage of our services, such as water and sewer. Drainage is the second largest one. So the commodity charges make up almost 50% of our revenue structure. Then you have the drainage charges as the second largest component, makes up 41% of our total revenue requirement. Service charges at 9% and fire line at 1% makes up the total pie of rate revenue. So summary of revenues and expenses. Again, this summarizes all our retail, non-retail revenue and breaks down revenue requirements by appropriation. We have 4 appropriations where the expenses are distributed: administration, operations, compliance, and finance, the lower bottom part of the slide. The top part is kind of summarizing what we shared so far with you in the slides previously. So this is an overall summary of our revenues and expenses. This is the water slide, and the next one is the sewer slide. Here is a slide on our FTEs, our full-time equivalents. As I mentioned before, we are increasing our net FTEs by 20 headcount for the operating budget. There is no change to the I&E or Improvement and Extension Fund. It's just the O&M 20 FTEs. Mentioned before, FTEs, this 20 are basically necessary to keep our operation and catch up on backlog. We certainly want to improve our service level initiatives. So there are 22 that got allocated to maintenance and repairs and major operations, offset by decrease of other FTEs from other cost centers, such as general counsel, org development, as well as public service and finance. So our overall headcount has gone up from 735 in FY25 to 755 in FY 2026. This is the summary of volume and rate data. Commissioner, you asked about the increase in volume and increase in usage. This kind of summarizes that data. If you look at how our tier one volume has increased 1.9% over 2025, and our tier two volume has also increased by 1.9% over 2025. So that increase helped us keep the rate down from our overall revenue requirement to from 5.5%. If you take out the 2% roughly, then you arrive at the 3.5% rate increase. The middle part of the slide gives you a synopsis of our equivalent units. Those have also increased compared to 2025, roughly about 2.5% increase in meter counts, service line equivalents, and a slightly smaller increase in connection equivalent. Overall, of course, we had a 2% increase in our equivalent units. And these are based on the forecast for FY26 is based on historical information, such as the last 18 months of where we are trending in terms of volume as well as in terms of meters. And then we take an assessment and make a projection in terms of, is this trend going to continue? And positively, we keep that focus and then project out FY26. Hopefully, this trend will continue, so our budget makes meaningful sense. If anything changes, we may have to do a mid-year adjustment depending on how the next six months of the fiscal year goes. That was for water. This is for sewer. Sewer is slightly less. We have a 1.1% increase in our volume in terms of the sewer usage. Service charge is also at 1%. So we are a little bit more conservative when it came down to the sewer projection for volume as well as equivalent units. At the bottom part of the slide is our drainage charge projection. We are projecting some increase in our BIA. Kind of went up from 26,100 billable impervious acres to 27,000 is what we are projecting, an increase of 900 billable impervious acres. Here is the summary of rates for water and sewer. As you see here, it's broken down by water, sewer. Within water, you have a rate for tier one, which uses up to 0.6 MCF. And anybody who uses more than 6 MCF would be tier two. We also have rates for our service rate as well as fire line. The second part of the chart here is for the sewer fund, where it summarizes the volumetric rate per MCF for sewer usage, and then, of course, the service rate and the drainage rate. Now, if you look at the chart here, it looks like 3.5% increase over across the board for water and sewer and drainage. If you focus on the volumetric rate for water, the 3.85% increase translates to 93 cents per MCF. Now, 93 cents per MCF equals to 93 cents increase per 7,480 gallons of water. So the increasing rate, and then if you convert it to per gallon rate, that comes to less than a cent. So for the tier one customers, for tier two customers, it's an increase of $1.65 per MCF or per 7,480 gallons of water. Converting again to gallons, the increase comes to less than a cent, 1 cent per gallon for both tiers. The new tier one rate in terms of gallon would be 0.004 cents per gallon for tier one and 0.007 for tier two customers. So it's pretty negligible when you look at it from a gallon standpoint. The 3.5% sewer volumetric rate increase translates to $2.05 per MCF. Again, $2.05 per 7,480 gallons, or roughly 0.0003 per gallon increase. The new rate of $61.01 for sewer per MCF equals to 0.008 per gallon. Service rates increased by 28 cents and 23 cents respectively per equivalent unit per month. And of course, finally, the drainage charge increases 3.5%. Again, the overall increase was greater than 5%, but again, brought down by increase in consumption or BIA. That rate is $24.82 per acre per month. Fire line is increasing at 1.6%, at $1.40 per equivalent unit per month. Do you have any questions on the rate or so far?
No.
Okay. The next slide, next two slides is our schedule of fees. As you know, we charge for different services we provide. Apart from providing uses for water and service fees, there are several items that are chargeable, and these are summarized here. The first slide here talks about the service type, service we render. The red highlights are the new items for FY 2026 and the ones that have changed in terms of pricing. Everything else in black, the price have not changed since last year. But the first two items are new. It was complimentary in the past. Now we're going to be charging those dollars for our services. Stop box replacement has gone up from $1,500 to $2,000. That's basically it, except for the last line where we say hydro excavation. We did not charge in the past. It's something that we'll have to start charging at $400. Everything else on the chart is exactly the same as FY 2025. The next slide is penalty type. For if you're missing an appointment, or if you have NSF, which is non-sufficient funds, or there's illegal turn-ons, or somebody's trying to tamper or cut cables, there are consequences to those actions, and we charge our customers for a fee for those kind of activities. There is no change in terms of our fee schedule. We are keeping it the same for FY 26 when it comes to FY 25 for any of those penalty type cost. And then at the end of the day, what is the impact of all of these numbers, all of these changes, all of these rate increases? How does it impact our customers, our service to the community as a whole? There are value-added benefits that result from this proposed budget. For example, we clean 6,000 miles of sewer lines to provide capacity to the current standards. Clean entire system in a 5-year cycle. That's the goal. We inspect and clean 8,000 catch basins to reduce street flooding. There's a mandate for 3,500 lead service line replacement, at least 8,000 lines if additional state or federal funding becomes available to us. Our goal is to remove all lines within a 10-year period. Nearly 12,000 have been replaced since 2018. We've painted 5,000 fire hydrants, which reduce corrosion. Completing Far West projects, detention basins and sewers to remove 100 million gallons of rainwater and snow melt annually from the combined sewer system, and the construction and completion of design of several other stormwater projects. We continue to provide and procure resources to support our water affordability through the Lifeline Plan and an effective payment plan that we designed this year called the Easy Pay to benefit our customers and keeping water services on while improving the collection rate. Our next step here, if there are no more questions, do you have any questions so far?
No.
Okay.
Any questions, anyone?
No.
Okay.
Okay, then the next step here would be today we'll be seeking your approval of the FY 2026 final proposed operating budget, as well as the rates and schedule of fees for 26. And we'll also be seeking your approval to recommend this budget to the full board, which is scheduled for March 19th of 2025. I just want to point out that in the past, we would do a proposed budget presentation and then a separate presentation for rates. This year, because of timing, we got delayed in presenting you the overall proposed budget. Because of timing difference, we are combining both the proposed budget as well as the rates approval with the same resolution. So,
A question.
yeah,
Okay, regarding these these recommendations for the increases, can you just state again? Sorry for the delay, but can you just state again the historical um, changes or increases that have been both recommended by GLEWA and what has actually been the action that the Board of Water Commissioners have actually adopted as far as the rates. I'm just saying, so the recommendation over the past, I think, 3 years or so, would like to know what has been the recommendation from GLEWA and what action this board has taken as far as rate increases.
so historically, over the last few years, we have kept our rates below 3.5%. Last year, for example, I think across the system, pretty much we had a 3.2% increase in our rates. This year, it's 3.5%. And a lot has to do with our share of the wholesale charges that GLWA increased this year. So GLWA's increase historically has been less than 4% because of there was a mandate for 10-year commitment not to increase rates beyond 4%. So they kind of honored that commitment and did not raise rates beyond 4%. In line with that, we were able to keep our rates down as well. 3.2% on an average 3% over the last 10 years or so. This year, that 10-year period ended. So GLWA increased their revenue requirement and their rates by 5.9% for the water system and 4.5% for the sewer system, which obviously has a direct impact on us because we pay a lion's share of our wholesale charges. But in spite of that, we were able to keep our rates down below 4% at 3.5% across the board. And a factor that contributed significantly helping to keep that rate down is the usage, the increase in usage for both the water as well as the sewer system. Historically, our increases have been less than 1%. I recall last year we had a 0.7% increase in the water volume and a similar increase in the sewer volume projection. This year, because of our historical performances over the last 18 months, we were able to raise that projection to 2% or 1.9 to be precise for the water system and a little over 1% for the sewer system. So the increase in volume has helped us offset some of the increases in our revenue requirements. Hopefully that answers your question. If not, I can explain more.
That answers my question. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Are there any other questions at this time?
If we're going to be doing the rate increase and the budget at the same time, do we have to convene a formal hearing?
Legal can jump in here, but you mean public hearing?
Yeah.
No, we are not required to have public hearing.
Okay, that's fine. And if we're not required, then let's not.
Okay. So that's why it is, for the sake of time, we are saying, okay, here's the budget, here are the rates. Today we'll be seeking your approval, and then we'll also be seeking your recommendation to the full board on March 19. We do have a city council presentation of our FY26 budget on March 21st. And all of these rates will go into effect on July 1, 2025 for the FY26 fiscal year. That concludes my presentation. Again, any question, any other question, I'll be more than happy to answer.
Any other questions?
No, very thorough presentation.
Thank you. Now we have two resolutions, I think, Donald. Yeah,
Okay, line item C, excuse me, line item B, 2025, tax 65. Commissioner, what is your pleasure?
Hang on just a second.
Tell you what, I'll read that one and
Okay,
get ready for the next one then, okay? Um, Members of the Finance Committee, I'd like to make a recommendation to the Board of Water Commissioners to approve the proposed schedule of Detroit retail water and sewer rates and fees consistent with the FY 2025 to 2026 revenue requirements and water and sewer system budgets approved by the Water Board Commissioners on March 19, 2025. And I also authorize directors and the chief financial officer to take such other action as may be necessary to accomplish the intent of this vote.
I support that.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Any abstention? Hearing none, this motion passes on to recommendation to the board.
And Mr. Chair, I would likewise move that the committee recommend to the board approval of the proposed two-year operating budgets for the fiscal years 2025 and 26, 2026 and 27 for the water operating fund in the amounts of $149,172,400 and $156,948,900 respectively, and for sewage disposal operating fund in the amount of $372,141,400 and 389,000, I'm sorry, $1,220,200 respectively, and authorize the director and the CFO to take any other necessary action.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Any abstentions? Hearing none, this motion passes for recommendation. Mr. Rahman, you have any other questions or comments for this motion?
no, I don't. And thanks for listening. And
So I do have a question for you though. Is there any reason why we didn't have this at the last meeting?
so the preliminary budget was presented to you in February.
Okay.
In March, we did not because we were still working and waiting for Great Lakes Water Authority to finalize their revenue requirement. That's why it wasn't presented in April.
Okay.
Sorry, in March. Yeah.
No, it makes perfectly good sense. Any other questions? Concerns? Okay, number 8, are there any other matters to be brought before the body? Hearing none, our next meeting is scheduled for the 19th. I'd like to call for a motion for adjournment, please.
Move to adjourn.
It is moved. I second it. All in favor, signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Meeting is adjourned. Thank you.
All right. Thank you all.
Thank you.